organization is about 3 years old, but basically we are the first Pakistani-run think tank in Kashmir. John Hopkins is collaborating with us, university is collaborating with us, so we have an academic family, we put the team together. So my job is to basically create a voice for our community in town. I moved from New York, I lived in Manhattan for 12 years. I moved here about 4 years ago. So, exactly.
Yeah. No, I'm saying I'm from Queens.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Anyway.
Oh, yeah, so that, I saw from your card. I live in Flushing, maybe about
Okay, I grew up in 60.
13 years ago. I love New York.
Yeah.
Kebab bhi khaya aapne wo?
Yeah, but I like okay, Pakistani restaurants.
वहाँ के बेहतर हैं.
And they make fresh food and everything. Because the Pakistani restaurant, well, sell a dish for $5 pieces. Here people pay for tariffs. But it's good. So you lived in New York?
Yeah, I lived in New York. I've been in DC 4 years. I'm policy in the US. I'm an English issue with social sciences.
Right.
I took an interest in this, and now I'm interested in seeing how we can make the organization sustainable for our community, for our people over here.
Yeah, definitely. We should talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of ideas.
We're putting our entire team together. So David Sullivan, someone who's worked in the embassy, president of the president, and so putting capacity and team. But
Yeah.
we'll talk.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
So we're still waiting for our third speaker.
Oh, okay.
Hopefully we'll be soon.
Yeah.
But if you're okay with it, we'll speak first.
Oh,
I'll
okay.
give intro remarks and then
Yeah.
he's going to say a few words.
You're recently out of outside the country.
Andrew.
Well, I mean, I'm
Okay.
still spending most of the time in DC at the moment, but back and forth to Europe a little bit in the first quarter of the year. I was in more time in Pakistan.
And you're going to speak at
half of last year station.
Yeah, so what do you think is, if you were comfortable up here, you can do that. Whatever
China.
you
China has,
Yeah.
it seems like they're simply a lovely bit of
How do you turn this off?
Yeah.
world leadership.
Michael, hi.
Oh, hi. How are you doing?
Well, and they're under, I mean, there's anxiety there as well. I think there's the combination of, there's an opening for them with the US stance being what it is on trade issues and some of these things to kind of step in. But there's all, I mean, there's scenarios in the US-China relationship.
Since you are an
that very
expert on China, how far do you think they've been successful in doing it? And they've been to Africa, they've been to Sri Lanka, and they've been to many places.
Yeah, and there's bigger places. I mean, I follow the China-Europe relationship quite
What do
closely.
you think
It's an
is-
interesting juncture there now. Because I mean, there is a zone at the moment where there's obviously a huge amount of concern about what happens to the global trade order, and China is a focal point of that concern. But now, in the hierarchy of concerns, there's bigger concern about what might come up from here. So I think they're in a position right now where they are working more closely.
No, they definitely think long term all the time. I mean, we think of 5 years and 10 years, they think of generations.
They have some short-term things in play as well.
I'm sure.
Xi Jinping has the Party Congress coming up.
It'll be interesting.
Andy Cutchins.
Shazad Habib with Indus. How are you?
Nice to meet you.
We're waiting for you. I thought you were
I can imagine. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Andrew Small.
Hey, Andrew. Nice to meet you. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Oh, take a deep breath. We
Good
can take
man.
a few minutes. We can
Okay.
have your seat.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to figure out that.
It is. Certainly love of water. Would be great. Thank you very much. Let me, Hey,
How's
Michael.
your
Nice to meet you.
weather? I actually
Pleasure.
was there in December.
Oh, yeah, right. When in December? Was it
It was
later?
First.
Sorry, no, I went in January.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
Supposed to go in December, but then the ATO, the plane crash happened.
And then they grounded all.
That's fine.
Are they flying them again, or did you
So,
go?
yeah,
on-
they're back
That
on.
makes sense.
So I just took a commercial flight.
Which is the
Okay. Yeah. No, it was they had grounded them just before going out, but it was being done by the Pakistani Navy.
Yes, I am.
So
Yeah.
it was fine, but
I still maintain a non-resident relationship with CSIS, but Georgetown's my day job, my main gig.
No, well, I mean, it feels like it's moving along.
It is, yeah. I mean, I was surprised. Did you get to go on any of the highway networks? Or?
Not like up into the interior
Yeah.
and things. I mean,
Because you were with a group, yeah.
town.
Midterm
or
exams
still
on the
kind of
Marine
South.
Drive and all that.
Yeah. So I mean, they were supposed to be kind of about.
Yeah. Actually, I got to go on N85 towards MA and all that. And I was surprised.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director with the Wilson Center's Asia program and also the Wilson Center's Senior Associate for South Asia. Thank you for joining us today for what should be both a stimulating and a very salient discussion. A few additional thanks are in order right away. First of all, thank you very much to INDUS, a research organization here in Washington focused on Pakistan-related issues. Thank you particularly to its director, Athar Javed. INDUS is our institutional partner for this event, and I really give full credit to you, Athar, for having the very excellent idea of co-hosting a seminar here on this very timely issue of Pakistan-China-Russia relations. And Athar will say a few words in just a few moments. I also wanted to thank the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute for Russia and the former Soviet states, and also the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S., both of which are co-sponsoring today's event. A few words about the Wilson Center and what we do. The Wilson Center is chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It serves as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. At the Wilson Center, preeminent scholars and experts research topics of national and international relevance. And in the spirit of President Wilson, who, as I'm sure all of you know, is the only U.S. president to have held a PhD, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy to inform and develop solutions to the nation's problems and challenges. So why convene an event around the relations between China, Pakistan, and Russia? Three countries that admittedly give many folks heartburn in this town. With everything going on in the world these days, and at home for that matter, it's easy to lose sight of what's been happening in South Asia over the last few months. There have been some very notable geopolitical developments there. These include what appear to be growing ties between Moscow, Islamabad, and Beijing. Most notably, these three countries have held a trilateral dialogue about Afghanistan and issued collective statements about reconciliation and terrorism in that country. There have been joint military exercises between Russia and Pakistan in recent months. There have even been rumors about the possibility of some type of Russian participation or role in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, that mammoth $50 billion, maybe it's even more than that now, Beijing-funded infrastructure project in Pakistan. There are some numerous questions about Pakistan-China-Russia relations these days, and today we'll focus, broadly speaking, on three in particular. First of all, what is going on here? What is motivating each country to pursue these heightened ties? What is each country trying to get out of it? Second, should we indeed be talking about an emerging coalition, or is that going too far? Is it too premature to be saying that? How serious could this arrangement be? If there really is something to it, can it be effective? China and Pakistan, of course, have a long-standing partnership. But is Russia perhaps the weak link, or at least the odd guy out? Because Moscow, after all, continues to be a good friend of New Delhi's, a friendship that goes back to the Cold War days. Third question we're going to be looking into, broadly speaking, is what does this growing China-Pakistan-Russia relationship mean for U.S. policy, and particularly its policy toward these three countries and the broader South Asia region? There's reason to believe that what we're seeing play out here is key actors responding to the uncertainty surrounding the U.S.'s future role in the region. We're very fortunate today to have three respected analysts with us who will address these questions, again, broadly speaking, as they apply to their country of expertise. We'll first hear from Arif Rafiq, focusing on Pakistan. I'll be very brief. You have the bios in front of you. He's the president of Vizier Consulting, which provides political risk analysis in the Middle East and South Asia. He's also a fellow at the Center for Global Policy and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, and his recent research has included some work on CPEC. Next, we'll hear from Andrew Small to focus on the China angle. He's a transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. That's a regional program that he established, and his research focuses on Chinese policy in South Asia, U.S.-China relations, among other issues. And then finally, we'll hear from Andrew Kuchins, who's a senior fellow with the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown, and he's also a senior associate with the Russia and Eurasia program at CSIS, and his expertise naturally revolves around Russian foreign policy and domestic policies. So we're going to go ahead and start in just a few moments, but first I wanted to recognize author Javed to come up and say a few words about today's event.
Thank you very much. First of all, my profound thanks to the Wilson Center and our learned moderator, Mr. Michael Kugelman, for his enthusiasm and his relentless work in arranging this event. Without him, it would not be possible. Now, I would like to give you a word about INDUS. INDUS, Mobilizing People's Power, is a registered non-profit think tank and research organization in Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to a progressive and politically stable Pakistan and strong US-Pakistan relations. After more than 6.5 decades of independent existence and scientific, technological, and industrial advances, Pakistan continues to struggle with some of the very fundamental issues. The most pressing of these issues is philosophical disagreements on identity, the state's continued ambivalence on critical policy issues, need for restoration of the rights of individual in national conscience, and lack of opportunities for the young Pakistanis to evolve the future political leadership of Pakistan. INDUS was born out of these concerns. And our focus in United States is policy discussions, policy debate on matters critical to Pakistan, and peer-to-peer, campus-based dialogue and exchange of views between the students here in United States and in Pakistan on issues of mutual interest, and particularly on youth leadership development and rights of the individual. In Pakistan, our focus is youth leadership development and promoting grassroots level awareness for the rights of the individual. We have a narrow focus. We would like to achieve something first and then move on to other things. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We hope you will enjoy listening to the experts and take home a lot of useful information about this interesting geopolitical coalition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Arf, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Mr. Javed. I'd like to thank the folks at the Wilson Center and INDUS for organizing this panel on this topic that is not only intriguing, but also potentially very critical for U.S. interests in South and Central Asia. So my task, as Michael had kind of suggested, is twofold. One, to discuss Pakistan's motivations in helping shape and participate in this embryonic triangle that includes Russia and China, and then get into the so what aspect. What does it mean for the United States and U.S. interests in the region? Now, the traditional way of addressing Pakistan's foreign policy is to kind of go back to 1947 and then in a very linear fashion get into the Cold War, the Afghan Jihad, the post-9/11 period. But my assumption is that most of this audience is largely familiar with the basic history of Pakistan's foreign policy, the complicated relationship with the United States, and the baggage of history. So what I'd like to do is kind of fast forward and start in the year 2011, and which I believe is was a pivotal period in terms of shaping this kind of emerging, this very tentative triangle that involves Beijing, Islamabad, and Moscow. So if you recall, 2011 was a very tumultuous year in U.S.-Pakistan relations. It began with an incident in January, an incident known as the Raymond Davis incident, in which a CIA security contractor killed 2 Pakistanis in the city of Lahore who were reportedly tailing him. Davis was arrested by Pakistani police and held in custody for several months. And when he was released, there was his detention was a very complicated manner. At first, President Obama had said that he was a diplomat. Turns out he was, if you looked at him, he was very bulky and he didn't really have the figure of a traditional diplomat. And it suggested he was.
I guess I can't be a diplomat then.
Oh, yeah. It suggested he was, he lifted a little more, his lifting weight was a little more than your average Foreign Service officer. So when Davis was released as part of a deal with the Pakistani families that were involved, the surviving members of the families of the 2 men, there was a drone strike in Datakhel in North Waziristan, in which 24 civilians were killed, or approximately 24 civilians were killed. A former U.S. official had told the Daily Beast that this was Leon Panetta's revenge for Raymond Davis. So at the beginning of this very tumultuous year, you see bad blood developing between the establishments in Islamabad and Washington, and it kind of reflected the frustration that was emerging, that had been developing in the year or so before because of the non-alignment of interests when it came to Afghanistan and counterterrorism. And then in May, there was a unilateral U.S. raid in Abbottabad, which resulted in the killing of Osama bin Laden. For the government of Pakistan, particularly the military, this was an event that was largely shameful. One, an international terrorist an international fugitive was caught hiding deep inside Pakistani territory, and the United States was able to penetrate Pakistani airspace deep within. And so it showed that there were some gaps in terms of Pakistan's air defenses. And so at that period of time, the military leadership, the army leadership in the country was quite popular, and these were the early dents in their popularity. It put them on the defensive. The ISI chief had to present himself before parliament and faced some very, it was a testy moment in which he was facing some tough questioning from parliamentarians. So the bin Laden raid had a very strong psychological impact in both Islamabad and Washington. I would say, members of the policymaking community in both capitals and in Rawalpindi, where the Pakistan Army is based, began to believe that the other side was more foe than friend, and so, so we see, some significant rupture in the relationship and a belief that in order to achieve their respective interests, that there was a need to engage in more aggressive, if not unilateral, activity. Now, anti-U.S. sentiment in Pakistan grew even more by the year's end when, in November of 2011, there was a U.S. attack, a NATO attack, on a Pakistani base just inside the Pakistani border, base known as Salala in the Momand tribal area, inside the federally administered tribal areas. 28 Pakistani soldiers were killed in what the U.S. has said was an accidental incident. And it actually took months for the United States to apologize. It was a process that was more complicated than it needed to be. To some extent, the fault was due to some advice from some elements in Islamabad, but in the end, it took around 7 months for the United States to apologize. During that period of time, the U.S., the NATO supply route from Pakistan into Afghanistan was suspended. And it took around 7 months for the United States to issue what is described as a statement of regret. So it's during this period that we see a joint civil military attempt to reassess Pakistan's foreign policy and what they perceive as a dependence on the United States. And in December of 2011, Pakistan's Foreign Office held what I think is an annual event, the Envoys Conference, in which the country's ambassadors and high commissioners meet and provide guidance to the federal government on the country's foreign policy. And as the gathering had recommended to the government to open up a new chapter in relations with Moscow, which was a historical Cold War foe of Islamabad. And it's also reported that around this time period, or in this year, that China had also encouraged Pakistan to reach out to Russia and cultivate this relationship. And in fact, in the Pakistani press and in speaking with members of Pakistan's foreign policy community, it seems as if Beijing has been encouraging Pakistan or Islamabad to reach out to certain countries in which relations have been testy or problematic, or there's a lack of strength in terms of the historical relationship. So that includes Iran. So it seems that China, to some extent, is leveraging its diplomatic heft and sagacity in order to ensure that Pakistan moves in a strategic path to some extent that perhaps in its view, may serve Pakistan's interests better. So more recently, we see that there are reports that Beijing has suggested that Pakistan and a number of other countries should join the BRICS grouping, that there should be an expansion of it. We also see China using its veto power in Pakistan's favor at the UN Security Council and at the IAEA. So this is a contrast in terms of Beijing's more agnostic approach towards Pakistan at the diplomatic stage, let's say in the 1990s. So in early 2012, the Pakistan's foreign minister at the time, Hina Rabbani Kar, had visited Moscow and began a dialogue on how to improve economic, diplomatic, and security cooperation between the two countries. Pakistan had been pushing for a high-level visit from the Russians, and there were claims that Vladimir Putin or others would visit, but these did not materialize. But what we did see was some very tangible discussions on energy, security, and diplomatic cooperation. With respect to energy, Moscow is a top natural gas exporter. Pakistan is heavily dependent on natural gas. Its natural gas supplies are depleting. There's a huge gap between supply and demand. And natural gas is going to be a big part of its energy generation, as well as vehicular and industrial fuel supply. So there were talks in terms of tangible discussions. There were early talks on energy cooperation. Moscow had expressed interest in financing, according to Pakistani sources, had expressed interest in financing the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline or even the TAPI pipeline. Those plans never came to fruition, but by 2015, both countries had engaged in serious discussions over the construction and financing of a gas pipeline from Karachi to Lahore. Those discussions had been complicated by sanctions on Rostec and negotiations over pricing, but it seems like they could be finalized this year. So on top of energy cooperation, there's also newfound cooperation over defense. In 2014, Moscow had lifted its decades-old arms embargo on Islamabad. This year, Pakistan will receive 4 Mi-35M attack helicopters, and there are discussions of potentially a sale of additional hardware. These helicopters or potentially even aircraft. Late last year, the two countries held their first joint military exercises in Pakistan, and this was a very a sensitive issue in which an early announcement had said that to some extent the exercises would take place in the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which India has kind of the claims over which India has renewed in recent years. So we have energy and defense cooperation, and alongside that, there are signs of kind of a diplomatic and strategic convergence. By 2015, there were rumors that Russia had begun to engage the Afghan Taliban. The next year, even Afghan officials had gone on the record to say that to allege that Russia was financing and even or arming or even training the Afghan Taliban, and by the year's end, Moscow had hosted trilateral discussions with Beijing and Islamabad on the future of Afghanistan. Importantly, left out of these discussions were New Delhi, Kabul, and Washington. And then towards the years, at the most recent BRICS summit, Moscow did not sort of embrace New Delhi's language on Pakistan and terrorism and issued a very soft statement in respect to concerns about terrorism in South Asia. So there's a distancing of Moscow from its traditional strong ties with convergence with New Delhi, and the movement towards the pivot towards Pakistan is complicating ties between New Delhi and Moscow. Now, at the same, or actually before Moscow had begun this more pronounced engagement in Afghanistan, China had begun to have a more strong diplomatic presence in the region. And so it was part of this, what is probably a failed quadrilateral dialogue group, the QDG, involving the United States, Afghanistan, and Pakistan on the future of Afghanistan. Beijing has hosted several delegations of the Afghan Taliban and has reportedly been attempting to prod both the Afghan Taliban and elements of the Pakistani government to move these militants towards a negotiation process with the Kabul government. Speaking with Pakistani officials, even in discussions in which this is not the core element of the focus of our talks, they seem to be quite bullish on what's this emerging kind of triangular relationship with Russia and China. Now, I think Andrew can speak more specifically about his estimation of what Moscow's interests are. Perhaps there's this is more of a tactical. These are tactical moves as opposed to a broader strategic change, but. Commentators in Pakistan and governmental officials seem to be quite optimistic about what they regard as a strategic alliance. Now, I'm not sure if that is an incorrect assessment on their part, but I think that has to be taken into consideration as to what the Pakistani perceptions are in respect to this emerging relationship. Now, let's get into the so what aspect. What does this mean for the United States? I think I'd like to just make some general comments in terms of lessons learned from these changes that are happening in Central and South Asia. One, I think that demonstrates the limits of our ability to generate behavioral change in Pakistan. I think in 2008, 2009, there was the creation of this entity called the Friends of Democratic Pakistan. The United States attempted to get China, Saudi Arabia, and other traditional partners of Pakistan to support the fledgling democratic government and engage in this kind of engineering in which a democratic, progressive, and pro-U.S. Pakistan would be formed. Now, there was a belief that aid, both as a carrot and a stick, in terms of the offering of aid and the threats to withdraw or reduce aid, would have an impact on shaping how Pakistan behaves in the region. But I think greater
thought should be put to in terms of assessing, how we can deal with what Pakistan perceives as the on-the-ground reality in Afghanistan and the border regions. So there's a belief that the government in Kabul has been hostile to the government in Islamabad, and that doesn't recognize the border. There's been a lack of tangible cooperation between Kabul and Islamabad in terms of policing the border. For example, whenever Pakistani forces set up some sort of fencing or border posts, this goes back to 2002, 2003, it's been knocked down by Afghan forces. I think we ought to think about, do a bit of a little introspection, look at, have we really invested the requisite amount of time in terms of helping forge this level of on-the-ground cooperation in respect to the border, which is a very tangible issue. I think, for example, on these type of issues, most recently, you see that London has hosted talks between Pakistani and Afghan officials on this. And why is it the case that they're doing it? Why aren't we investing our time in this? And it's traditionally the case that the British have been playing a role in terms of trying to ameliorate these crises between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, are we leveraging our diplomatic heft when it comes to Pakistan-Afghan relations? Now, also, I think we tend to underestimate Pakistan's ability to engage in diplomatic finesse and play the global chessboard in its favor. So, I think since 2008, we've conflated Pakistan with Afghanistan, and we forget that it has a professional army, a very capable diplomatic corps, and an institutional memory that goes back decades and probably is much stronger than our own. And so, our own presence in the region is to some extent a liability, and I think we ought to consider, as we make assessments over troop levels and our physical presence in the region, we ought to consider whether heightening, escalating conflict in the region or kinetic activity and the physical presence of Americans in Afghanistan will serve our interests, or will it provide regional states with an opportunity to, at the very least, complicate things for us, bog us down, and produce not necessarily a bear trap, but kind of an eagle trap, where we're just stuck in this rut where there's no clear strategic vision, and we are investing resources and human lives without any clear strategic vision. So I think this movement towards this expansion of the diplomatic process, or this search for reconciliation in Afghanistan to include Russia, may be an opportunity we could leverage. Perhaps the Russians are simply trying to complicate things for us and use this as part of some sort of grand bargain with the United States. But it could be that there's a legitimate desire to take this process to its end and achieve some sort of progress in terms of curbing the drug trade, which impacts Russia significantly, containing ISIS, and also producing some sort of long-term stability in Afghanistan. So I think as the Trump administration assesses its options in Afghanistan and to some extent Pakistan, this may be an opportunity to gain more partners in terms of the pursuit of reconciliation in Afghanistan. And it may not be some new sort of axis of eagle that is, that will be, produce Fox News alerts every other day and kind of hyperbolic rhetoric in the U.S. press. It may be an opportunity to kind of produce some sort of durable peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Arif. It gave us a lot to think about and chew on. Andrew Small, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to both to Michael and his colleagues here at the Wilson Centre and to INDUS for putting this together and for having me along. I'm going to provide a little bit of context on the China-Pakistan relationship and where it's headed at the moment before talking about the Russia dimension to an extent and what all of this means for the US. So like Arif, I'm going to skip the sort of prehistory as far as possible and sort of fast forward to what's been going on in the last couple of years. I think really the China-Pakistan relationship is undergoing its biggest shift since, you could either put it back to 9/11, you could put it back to the normalization of Sino-Indian relations. There's a really important qualitative shift taking place in the relationship. It has traditionally always been a highly security-centric relationship in which the role that Pakistan has played, seen through Chinese eyes, has been to play this counterbalancing role for China in South Asia vis-a-vis India, and China has consistently been willing to help provide the capabilities and support that Pakistan needs to occupy that role. You have always, throughout this relationship, despite the fact that you've had a small number of kind of high-profile economic projects, very visible things like the Chashma nuclear plants, the Karakoram highway, a couple of these sorts of things, the economic relationship, whether in trade or investment, has been extremely weak for an assortment of reasons that I won't go into just now. But what you have with CPEC is the first point really in the relationship that you have a genuinely significant economic dimension and an economic dimension in ways that recondition various other elements of the relationship. Unlike past promises, I think there's a statistic that from 2001 to 2011, you have about $60 billion of projects that were supposedly going to happen, of which only about 6% of them come through. Sorry, 66 billion. This is different. It's very clearly different on the ground and in terms of the momentum of what's going on. Whether one reaches the very high numbers that are being flung around on this, you certainly have double-digit billions worth of projects underway already. And I think increasingly it looks less implausible that you will get to some of these somewhat higher numbers, even if it's not 52, 53, 54 billion dollars or whatever the latest number that's being cited is. And this is having a number of implications for the relationship, whether it's the inevitable deepening of political focus that is now coming from the Chinese side, the vastly larger number of actors that are involved from the Chinese side. This has really been a relationship that's been a pretty narrow group of people on the two sides have managed, largely on the PLA side and the Pakistani army with some of the leading civilians there too. Now you have a substantial array of new actors coming into play on both on the Chinese side and a degree of immersion in the kind of day-to-day economy, day-to-day politics that China has never really experienced before in the relationship, when it sort of sat back as this sort of removed, slightly mythologized figure. Now I think it's much more in the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day political battles and analysis. But I won't go into that in so much depth. What I want to look at is why is this taking place? Why is it that CPEC is being pushed ahead despite some of the challenges that were there before, rather than what used to happen, which is a lot of these economic projects were stopped whenever they faced even relatively modest problems. And then what does this imply for some of these other questions that we're looking at vis-a-vis the relationship with Russia? And so why is this happening now on China's part? First of all, I think that a few trends that I think are playing into this, and this just looking through the Chinese prism rather than from the Pakistani side for now. First of all, I think friends count for more for China than they used to. As strategic competition with the US intensifies, I think China's inadequate approach to sustaining friendships, let alone alliances, is understood to be a strategic disadvantage. And particularly as China looks to develop more out-of-area capacities, whether that's use of naval facilities, or even partners for some of the new proposed overseas counterterrorism operations. Some of these security partnerships that still fall short of being formal alliances start to become an increasing focus. And the country that is top of the list of security partnerships that fall short of being alliances is certainly Pakistan. Though at a lower but still interesting grade is the China-Russia relationship for the people on the Chinese side who are thinking about long-term friendships, if not alliances. Second trend has been growing concern for stability in Xinjiang, China's northwest province. This has been true particularly since 2009, but I think following what was a very difficult first phase during Xi Jinping's presidency, which included a point at which the day he was in Urumqi, there was a major attacks in Tiananmen Square, attacks in Kunming. This has become a much higher point of sensitivity on the Chinese side than it used to. They'd gone through virtually a decade without terrorist attacks from the late 90s to around 2008, and that started to change after 2009. And that dovetailed with concerns on China's part about the US drawdown in Afghanistan. And therefore, between these two factors, the sense that there would need to be a more serious effort on China's part to stabilize its western periphery, including through these kind of grand Marshall Plan style efforts through Chinese investment and financing, but also through closer security cooperation with other actors in the region. The third trend, briefly, I think China has started to see the US-India relationship as a much more settled strategic fact. I think for a period of time, at a series of different junctures, there was some hope on their part that things might unravel. I think as you've now seen it pass through a series of different administrations on the US side and governments on the Indian side, I think China has started to treat the relationship in somewhat different terms. And of course, China does also see, for obvious reasons, the US-Pakistan relationship as in a decline, and therefore, when thinking about bolstering Pakistan's position, as it has consistently done, has started to play a more active role, not just bilaterally, but in thinking about some of Pakistan's other partners. Fourth trend, and the kind of most immediate set of drivers for CPEC itself, the shift in the Chinese economic model, I think where the domestic downturn in China and the longer-term economic transition has necessitated a push to both address the problems of overcapacity and low returns on investment at home, and has resulted in this enormous impetus kind of comes together under the auspices of this Belt and Road Initiative to build new markets abroad, find new growth drivers in the Chinese interior, and move away from the previous kind of pattern of its outbound investment model focused on natural resources towards these big industrial and infrastructure projects. And CPEC has ended up becoming, I think slightly to everyone's surprise, the flagship project for the entire initiative. RF actually has a very good report coming out on CPEC in April, which I advise you to read when it emerges. I won't say quite as much about CPEC now, but just in terms of the context of some of the reasons this is happening in Pakistan, Pakistan's one of the only places where China's been able to find a country that's willing and receptive to investments on such a large scale and in a manner that Beijing wants to see them happen, and that manner being one in which Chinese companies have a pretty privileged position. It's also one of the locations where I think the potential political and strategic benefits are seen as worth the risks in such a large investment package. This combines a couple of a couple of different elements. I think China sees a stronger, more normally functioning Pakistani economy as reducing the risks of extremism in the country, and in the more kind of traditional geopolitics of the region, China thinks Pakistan can't sustain as effectively the traditional balancing role that it plays if its economy is in a weak position. And I don't include among the benefits for CPEC this connectivity from Xinjiang to Guadar, which I really don't think in the end is as important to China, even though it's an important part of the mythology around CPEC and the symbolism, and it's the maps are very exciting and things, and I think things will happen in Guadar, but I think the transit elements are going to be a pretty modest part of the utility of CPEC for China. I think it's much better understood as a large-scale investment package than something that's going to be moving goods and energy from Baluchistan to Xinjiang, where all of the problems that previously existed, as much topographical as any security questions, are still there. Now, implicit in all of these factors, I think, is a reason in each case why China would see some value in a closer Russia-Pakistan relationship, and in a few limited respects in trilateral cooperation. And as Arif said, I think China has been in sort of modest ways helping to facilitate this relationship, and if there are problems or headaches that have come up, I think the Pakistanis have been able to gain China's help in being able to navigate some of them. Now, China's approach has pretty consistently been to encourage other major powers to support Pakistan, and again, to ensure that Pakistan has the capabilities it needs. Now, for a long time, that was the United States. China has long encouraged Pakistan, including at delicate junctures like the period in 2011 that Arif mentioned, that Pakistan should still sustain a close relationship with the United States for all the financial and security benefits that brings. But during a period in which that's in decline, there are obvious reasons for China to help Pakistan to diversify some of its partnerships. And this is particularly the case in a context where the security relationship with Pakistan is deepening, but the security relationship with Russia is also deepening. And I think more broadly, this is a context in which China is looking at developing closer ties, not just bilaterally with security partners, but in kind of stitching some of these partnerships together. And again, not to suggest any equivalence between the depth of the China-Pakistan relationship on the military side and that history, and where the China-Russia relationship has got to in the last few years. But one of the areas in which I think this has had some quite specific application has been counterterrorism and Afghanistan, as Arif mentioned, where I think there is clearly value seen on China's part to closer coordination to ensure that all sides' interests are maintained. And again, this is one of a series of different overlapping quads, trilaterals. There are meetings that include Afghanistan, there are meetings that don't include Afghanistan, there are meetings that include India, there are meetings that don't include India. I think this is a part of a complementary set of diplomatic approaches that China has on Afghanistan, and one among a number of experiments diplomatically and militarily, as we've seen with some of the new quadrilaterals that China has been pulling together, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, for instance, to try and find constellations that can help to address some of its concerns there. And then there's also the CPEC dimension. First of all, there's the access to Central Asian republics for Pakistan, where China has always been careful to ensure that that efforts of this side are coordinated with Russian blessing. And more generally, I think on CPEC, there's still a degree of suspicion on China's side about the involvement of various other outside actors and what their intentions are, and that includes the United States. However far it takes a formal position, at least discreetly in support of CPEC, I think there's still a degree of suspicion on China's part, and although it is looking to broaden CPEC out, ultimately it has a preference for doing that among countries that it trusts. Now, there is a kind of theology of CPEC in which people talk about countries joining CPEC and things. And is Russia joining CPEC? Which I don't think is actually, again, the most relevant way of thinking about it. Of course, in principle, there would be a formal way in which outside parties participate in CPEC-designated projects and so on. But if Russia, without formally joining CPEC, makes use of Pakistani port facilities, builds a pipeline that helps to support Pakistan's energy needs, and a whole list of other things. Whether these are designated as part of CPEC or not, I don't think is the most important criterion. I think what matters is whether there is some degree of a complementary role that's played. And so I think, for instance, when it comes to squaring the sensitivities with India about formal involvement in CPEC, I don't think it's a strictly necessary part of how Russia need conduct itself with respect to the project. And lastly, of course, China also sees some degree of rebalancing on the Russia-Pakistan relationship, a degree of an upgrade as a counterpoint to the India-US relationship. I think China, of course, sees some value in conveying to India that deepening ties with the United States are not cost-free. As Michael suggested at the beginning, I really wouldn't oversell any of this. I think the Russia-India relationship is still has real depth. These are still pretty modest steps so far, but I think it is interesting, at least, that China has been facilitating and encouraging it. Just to wrap up, a couple of words on the US implications. South Asia has just not really been a meaningful area of competition between the two sides, between the US and China, and at points has actually been a rare area of cooperation. As I've already mentioned, there've been areas of real convergence on support for Pakistan in various respects. China backing a close US-Pakistan relationship, the US actively encouraging Chinese efforts to invest in the country. I think although there's still, again, some delicacy about how this is presented publicly, if you look at the Hangzhou summit statement that was issued a few months back between the US and China, there is a specific passage in that does not refer to Pakistan, but is entirely about US-China cooperation on clean energy projects in Pakistan that have a CPEC-related quality to it. I don't think that many people in the region tend to believe that the US is being actively supportive of this project. I think the suspicion exists there as well as in China, but I think for a sustained period of time the US has taken a view that it would be helpful if China stepped up its investments on the civilian rather than purely on the military side, and I think that's still true. There's been a convergence on Afghanistan, of course, the area where US and Chinese intelligence services worked very closely together with Pakistan in the 80s, and as we've seen again in recent years, particularly on the peace process, whether the quadrilateral coordination group is dead. I think both China and the United States will still be central actors in whatever emerges or fails to emerge from any of that process. And as well, I think there's been a degree of crisis management that the two sides have very discreetly pursued when it's come to scenarios between India and Pakistan, where I think the US and China have often been surprisingly well coordinated, at least since Kargil in '99. So a lot of these areas are, for understandable reasons, not always made so public. I think it is seen as a matter of some delicacy in the region that any of the countries might be kind of subjected to big power management. But I actually think, unlike in East Asia, where, of course, strategic competition between the United States and China is in all sorts of respects intensifying, this has tended to be a region where, although it's not a close degree of coordination on a few important areas, the two sides have tended to see their interests, I think, as somewhat more aligned than not. How do some of these developments with Russia affect that? I just don't think they necessarily do yet. I don't think it's crossed a threshold in terms of the significance of what this kind of trilateral grouping might look like. or Russia's involvement yet, where it would materially affect the parameters of how the United States and China look at this. There is a broader set of geopolitical developments that could, of course, completely recondition this. And as we're figuring out what the new administration's policies are on this, I think there are some fundamental questions about whether, for instance, the US-China relationship could become competitive in regions in which it had not previously been competitive. And there'd be perfectly credible reasons for South Asia to be one of those. But I think that would be a set of choices that exist here rather more than in terms of the dynamics of what's now playing out between Russia and Pakistan.
Thank you, Andrew. Interesting. Well, we're now going to go to the other Andrew to discuss the Russia question a bit more.
Thanks very much, Michael. Andrew, I wouldn't hold my breath about Russia joining CPEC, not in the imminent future. And Arif, I think probably one of the last organizations the Russians are going to support will be the Friends of Democracy in Pakistan. That's not really their MO. It's not really the way they operate. But all kidding aside, I mean, really, how much has changed since the 1980s when the Soviet Union, Russia, fought the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who were supported by the United States, Pakistan, China, and Saudi Arabia? How much has changed since 2001 when Russian intelligence, logistical support, arms to the Northern Alliance? The Russians were probably the most valuable partner for the United States in taking down the Taliban in the fall of 2001. That was the most robust security cooperation that has taken place in the 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union between the United States and the Russian Federation. How much has changed since 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, which we just noted the third anniversary of, March 18th, 3 days ago, when the Russians announced the annexation, which was greeted with tremendous, as the Russians say, burny aplodismenti, like very loud applause, like at the Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Congresses that used to take place. The short answer is that a lot has changed, really a lot, in a short period of time. The Russians are still under sanction, of course, to the United States and the Europeans, Japanese, and some others. This is now 3 years. That's quite a lengthy period of time. The Sino-Russian relationship, as my colleagues have noted, is far stronger in economic terms, in security terms, foreign policy terms. And Russia's positions in Afghanistan and its relations with Pakistan, which I'll focus most of my remarks on, have changed quite significantly in the past few years. And this kind of change illustrates just how dynamic and fluid geopolitics and geoeconomics today are in the Eurasian heartland, so to speak. And so I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to the Wilson Center and INDUS for organizing this session to return to this geography and this set of very changing relationships. I spent a lot of time in my time at CSIS in the last 6-7 years working on Afghanistan, a regional economic cooperation strategy for Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Sino-Russian relationship, and had a project that was called Eurasia Reconnecting. And the thesis basically of the project is that the Eurasia, broadly construed, from Europe to China, from Russia to India, the world island, so to speak, is a period of tremendous dynamic fluidity. And a lot of the changes are being driven really by economic changes, first and foremost. But those, of course, have influence on political relationships, they have relations on security relationships, and a lot of other things that are happening. But we don't tend to get a very comprehensive view on it because typically we have a European specialist or a South Asia specialist or a China specialist or a Russia specialist. So one thing I'm looking forward to next year at Georgetown is developing a course for undergraduates and graduates on Eurasia Reconnecting and making that a continued major focus of my research. So it was fun to have the opportunity to kind of return to this, because I haven't been thinking about it as much in the last couple of years, particularly in the last 6 months or so. As you may have noticed, there have been some things going on in the U.S.-Russia relationship that have required virtually daily attention. In fact, across town today. But the changes, some of which have been noted by my colleagues in Russia, is quite striking. And there was an interesting interview published with Zamir Kabulov, a real veteran, so to speak. Zamir Kabulov was once the ambassador to Afghanistan. Recently, he's now their special envoy. He came to Afghanistan in the 1980s, as he described, as a young diplomat. But really, he came with the KGB, and actually he became the resident. And for those of you that watch the Americans, you know the resident in the embassies of the Soviet Union, that was the head of the KGB operations in Afghanistan. So this is a dude that has been in the region for a long time and has a lot of experience in the region. And this interview that he gave with to the Turkish media was quite interesting and in some parts kind of entertaining, but I think also very telling. He first of all talked about the Taliban and the Russian position on the Taliban. It tended to be more categorical in years past. There was not good and bad Taliban. There was bad Taliban, and that was it. The Chinese were actually came around earlier to looking at the Taliban and thinking about negotiating and talking to the Taliban than the Russians did. But in this interview, Kabulov talked about the Taliban as being actually quite diverse, and for the most part, they are now a local force. There are still, some that have more ties, of course, to broader international jihadist Islamic groups, the Haqqani network, and so forth. And those are folks that the Russians would not deal with. But this is quite a change in the Russian policy toward the Taliban. That they are talking to the Taliban. Now, yes, there are rumors of the Russians providing military assistance to the Taliban and even training. Well, the Russians have all kinds of modalities to transfer arms and even to provide training, which don't necessarily leave their fingerprints on them very, very clearly. So that may well be happening, but I haven't seen that is actually confirmed. But it's a very significant change that has taken place in the last few years, 2-3 years to be more specific. And just for fun, I'll quote his part of the interview where he talks about the role of U.S. bases in Afghanistan, because here there's a big change. Quote, "We expect that Donald Trump will tailor a new American approach to Afghanistan once he finds it." Sorry, that was my interjection. Excuse me. Sorry. And he should address several issues which are a matter of concern not only to Russia but important regional actors like China, Iran, Pakistan, and others. At the end of its failure, why does the United States want land bases in Afghanistan? We don't have a clear-cut answer. Barack Obama, on one hand, cuts the troops in Afghanistan. On the other hand, he forces Afghans to accept U.S. bases. At first, they tried to do this with then President Hamid Karzai, and later they made the new administration sign the bilateral security agreement, which presumes 9 American bases on Afghan land. In Turkey, they only have 1 base. In Afghanistan, they have the right to use 9 big military bases, plus almost 10 more. Why? And the interviewer says, "Is that disturbing to you?" Of course! Why should it not be disturbing for anybody? Why in Afghanistan? Where is Afghanistan? Where is America? If we did something like that in Mexico, would it not be disturbing for America? In Cuba, we have already experienced, and we know the outcome. I think it's old-fashioned. Why are they doing it after all this 15-year-old anti-terror rhetoric in Afghanistan? They stupidly try to say it is for training. I like this guy. He kind of calls him as he sees him. Come on! You are not talking to stupid or foolish people. We know the reasons for the ongoing U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. Russia will never tolerate this. The interviewer says, "What was the purpose of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan?" He's a great straight guy. And Kabulov responds, "Multi-purposes. But first of all, after they were kicked out of Iran, they had this problem." Do you mean the 1979 Islamic revolution in Iran? Yes, in Iran's 1979 Islamic revolution, the Americans, lost the biggest military base in the region, which was capable of controlling vast areas of that part of Asia. So Afghanistan was, for that, because it was an available option and a nearby country to Russia, Central Asia, China, Iran, and Pakistan. Americans are really worried about the nuclear capability of Pakistan. All the sentiments of the first Islamic bomb is one thing. It is rhetoric, but it's still a factor. If the 2001 invasion had also political and economic sides, Afghanistan is relatively at the center of the three biggest hydrocarbon reserves in the world, the Persian Gulf, the Caspian Sea, and the Central Asia. Afghanistan has easy access to all three. Before, Iran served that purpose during the Shah era, with growing China and resurgent Russia. They needed such a thing. Well, this is a big, now, Kabulov is kind of a colorful guy, obviously, but this is a big change in Russian rhetoric about Afghanistan and policy toward Afghanistan, and it's, some would say, oh well, the Russians, oh, this is a Soviet mentality that he's talking about. No, it's not a Soviet mentality. It's a Russian mentality. It's a traditional Russian mentality, and the Russians do traditionally think in geopolitical terms. And some in Washington may call that 19th century thinking, but most people around the rest of the world, especially in the region that we're talking about, also think in these kinds of terms, or maybe even to a previous century. In fact, in some cases, so what is to justify this turn to the Taliban to the extent that the Russians have? Well, the Russians, talk about fighting ISIS in Afghanistan. Kabulov's all over the map on this. One day he says there are 10,000 ISIS fighters in Afghanistan. The next day there's 3,500. The next day there's 7,000. I think the number is far, far less than that, and the Russians tend to exaggerate it. I think the Russians have accepted that, yes, there are diverse groups in the Taliban, and they want to be in the game. They want to be in the game for whatever the resolution is in Afghanistan. I think that's the principal driver. Do they want to reduce the drug flow? To some extent, there's a lot of rhetoric about that, but there are certain Russians that make a lot of money off of the drug flow. But the official government position is that they would like to reduce the drug flow. Do they want to counter U.S. and NATO influence in Afghanistan? To some extent, possibly. But the position that Mr. Putin took back in 2001, it was mainly the Russian position for the next decade or so afterwards, was that, hey, look, the Americans are doing our dirty work. We don't want these guys coming into Central Asia, because Central Asia is basically, for the Russians, going into Central Asia is basically like going into Russia. And in fact, the Russian troops are guarding the borders in Tajikistan, and also to some extent in much less so in Turkmenistan. Are they looking for a bargaining card with Trump in this so-called grand bargain? I'm skeptical that this is what's driving this play, simply because the play itself long predated the election of Mr. Trump. And the Russians actually never, by the way, expected Mr. Trump to win the election. Nobody expected Mr. Trump to win the election, but that's another matter we'll leave for the guys in the other part of town to talk about. And but also, this is a way for the Russians, when they amp up the ISIS threat, it's a way to justify their military presence in Central Asia. And I think that's a significant factor driving this as well. So then we look to Pakistan. This is really a pretty significant change. In 2002, I remember thinking that when President Bush talked about the axis of evil, the so-called axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, I thought, well, what would be a Russian axis of evil? Well, okay, let's see. Probably Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, maybe Georgia, or Estonia, or some post-Soviet state du jour that they had a big problem with. But I mean, the Pakistani relationship for the Russians have been problematic for a long, long, long time, and so this is a rather significant change. What's driving it? I think it's one factor, of course, is that their traditional partner India has moved closer to the United States. Two, again, I think what's probably the more important driver for the Russians is that they want to be in play for the resolution of Afghanistan. And in order to do that, they need a better relationship with Pakistan. And then on the arms side, well, heck, the Russians like selling arms everywhere, to everybody. They're very pragmatic about that. In fact, they like selling to both sides in the conflict. Whatever it is, it gives them leverage with both sides in certain negotiations. So the Russians are, maintaining ties with the Ghani government. They are increasing ties with the Taliban. Some might, is that a contradiction? No, it's not a contradiction. It's just some hedging on their part and thinking that at some point, I think as probably most people would think, at least I think, I won't speak for most people, okay, that, you know, that there has to be, for a diplomatic resolution, there has to be some kind of meeting of the mind between the Taliban and the Afghan government. So it was interesting, this military exercise that between Russia and Pakistan that took place in September. It involves 70 Russian and 130 Pakistani special forces, from what I understand, and held in northern Pakistan. Now, the Indians apparently had directly requested the Russians to call off the exercises because of an attack on September 18th, which had taken place on an Indian military base, which the New Delhi thought was basically fomented by sources supported by Pakistan. The Russians didn't do that. They went ahead with it. Maybe there was a plan for a larger military exercise. I'm not quite sure, but it still took place. And Pakistan offered the great offer: use of the port of Gwadar. Gwadar. You know, last time I looked at Gwadar, it was about maybe 3 years ago. No ship had actually come into the port of Gwadar. Now, they may have changed in the last 3 years, but the reason why no ship had come to the port of Gwadar, in fact, the first one that tried, it ran aground, is because the Chinese company didn't dredge deep enough for the port. So it's not a really very well-built port. And frankly, you know, why would you invest in the port of Gwadar when there is no connectivity of Gwadar, you know, of modern roads or modern rails, you know, to get to places elsewhere? And this gets to the point of the CPEC corridor. And you know, what are the obstacles, you know, for that? Well, some of them are fairly obvious. You know, Baluchistan is not exactly the most stable place in the world, and you know, there are issues on the Sino-Indian border. There are issues on the Indian-Pak border, obviously. And there are a lot of political challenges, I think, you know, on developing the corridor. And one thing that I discovered in the work that started with studying the Northern Distribution Network, and then looking at transit issues and logistical issues, you know, for a regional strategy for Afghanistan, is that it's not infrastructure which is the biggest obstacle to getting things from point A to point B. It's not security either. The biggest obstacle is it's the soft infrastructure. It's corruption. It's things getting held up at borders. That's the real problem. And if the Chinese can help to solve that problem through one bridge, one road, you know, that's terrific. But it's going to be a very, very, very hard problem to solve. And you think about, you know, who's going to insure things in this corridor, you know, unless you are confident that the security situation is taken care of. And then if I'm the Chinese, I'm thinking, well, you know, I'm not going to make a large-scale infrastructure investments in this corridor unless I can be confident that the security relations are going to be relatively well taken care of. And are they prepared to do that? I don't know. But the Russians are not going to spend money on it. That's for sure. They're particularly these days. I mean, even with the oil price going up a lot, the Russians are not going to be enthusiastic about, you know, building a pipeline from Central Asia going down south, unless, of course, you know, it was Transneft and the Rottenberg brothers that got the contract for it to build it at an extremely inflated price. You know, then they might have some skin in the game, but I don't see that's something they're going to be very, very enthusiastic about it. And you know, as my colleagues noted, the Russians are going to be very careful about their relationship with India. You know, along with China, India and China have been, for the last 2 decades, more than 2 decades, the 2 largest arms purchasers from the Russian Federation. So I think the Russians are going to be very careful about, how far they would go with Pakistan. How much can they actually gain from the relationship with Pakistan? When I think they have a more significant, certainly from the arms sale relationship with the Indians. Now this, I'm kind of to get to my last point, or second to last point, because I think it does I think it illustrated to me when I read this that this is, I think, what's driving the Russians. That in March 2016, Prime Minister Sharif invited Putin to visit Islamabad, and Putin stiffed him, said no, not enough agenda. Now, no Russian president has ever been to Pakistan, but I think when the Russians say not enough agenda, they're not happy about the fact that they're not included in these peace talks with China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Taliban, and that may be the quid pro quo, so to speak, for Mr. Putin to take a visit down to Islamabad. So I think that well, what does this mean for the Trump administration? Well, it's really hard to say. I mean, we have no idea what the Trump administration's policy toward Afghanistan is. I mean, frankly, we have no idea what the Trump administration's policy toward Russia today is. There is no policy toward Russia today. I think until some certain issues get resolved, they'll be very, very hamstring as to what they can do. My own personal view is, look, if somebody can, if there can, through institutions and through other states taking measures to try to bring greater peace and security between India and Pakistan in particular, then more power to them. And so that, I think this, the economic corridors, transit and otherwise, I believe in the value of them, but I think there's going to be, I would curb my enthusiasm about how soon they're going to happen, until some pretty sticky political issues get resolved. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for those very rich, enlightening presentations. I'm going to play the role of the selfless moderator and not ask the first question. In the interest of time, I want to make sure we get to some questions from you all. But I guess if there's a big headline here that we've heard from the three of you, it's that we should not expect any sort of formal alliance between these three countries, though. At the same time, we should not overlook the very real possibility of deeper cooperation, even if on levels that wouldn't necessarily entail any sort of formal arrangement later on. We'll start with some questions, and if it's okay with the panelists, we'll take a few at once. I think that'll allow us to take more in the limited time. If you could wait until a microphone's in front of you, pose one question, and keep it brief, and please identify yourself. So if we could have a show of hands, we'll start with the gentleman right down here. Yep.
What's the situation on China trying to gain influence in the former Soviet Central Asia, the stands? Is that currently Russian territory, or is that another area nearby where the two countries might compete?
Okay, now 2 rows back to the gentleman right here.
My name is Khawar Hassan, and I think we should be paying more attention to Iran joining this coalition very soon. That's the part that we have not considered here, but it seems to be very much on the cards, and that would create a very, very powerful coalition that would be a headache for a lot of countries.
Okay, and let's take another question on this side. I thought I saw a hand up here. Maybe there wasn't. Okay, let's go to the other side of the room. And sorry, Joshua, the gentleman right here.
Yes, David Abramson, State Department. My question is for all three panelists about what you think the prospects of the six-party talks on Afghanistan are likely, how likely they are to proceed with the possible additions of the Central Asian governments, the Taliban, and the U.S.
Okay, let's take one more question. The gentleman on the aisle there, yep.
Bob Icord, formerly with Aid and State, worked for 30 years on energy issues in Pakistan. Money, it talks, and obviously the Chinese are putting in major funds to develop the infrastructure and energy sector in particular, which has been a high priority of Sharif. Is there any backlash in Pakistan to this in terms of the overwhelming sort of dominance that Pakistan is moving toward in terms of nuclear, hydro, renewables, all these different areas, as well as obviously the issues related to gas and Iran's role? Thank you.
Okay, so let's stop there. We had a question about the notion of China trying to gain more influence in Central Asia. There's a good question about Iran's possible role in this coalition. A question about prospects for six-party talks in Afghanistan, and that last question about a potential backlash in Pakistan. So how should we start? There was a specific question about China, one about Pakistan. Does anyone want to start?
Could you just clarify that question about the energy? It was a bit unclear. You said backlash in Pakistan in respect to the energy supply mix?
Well, clearly it's a big issue, but and since the new initiatives from China to pour billions of dollars into the sector, whether it's nuclear, continuing the nuclear issues, the developing new hydro facilities, developing ports, renewable energy development. So it's a big change that I see over the last couple of years in terms of the magnitude of their investment in this sector. And the question is, how is that seen? Is there concern in Pakistan about becoming too dominant on China?
Okay. Did you want to take that first?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think in Pakistan, the general public is largely appreciative of this pretty rapid and large-scale effort to deal with Pakistan's energy deficit, electricity deficit. But at the same time, many specialists have been concerned about the terms of these commercial contracts. There are claims that Chinese companies on, let's say, some coal power projects have been guaranteed, profits of upwards of around 35%. The Chinese have, in the perspective of some, have been pretty aggressive in terms of ensuring that their companies get preferential tariff rates that aren't consistent, that are more advantageous than, let's say, the general tariff rates that are made by Pakistan's regulatory authority. So, so I think for the Pakistanis, there's claims by the government that load shedding or the electricity deficit will end by 2018 or 2019. That may be, I think that there's a significant likelihood that it could end by 2019. But when it comes time to pay back to deal with the payment challenges in terms of in Pakistan with the circular debt and things like that, I think you may see greater sensitivity towards the Chinese role.
Did you want to go ahead, Andrew?
Yeah, just on the first question on China and Russia and the stands. I mean, the phenomenon that's taken place over the last decade or so is that the Chinese have completely displaced the Russians economically in Central Asia, and the Russians have acquiesced to that reasonably calmly. The Russians still, of course, they have, I think, they're a more significant security actor in the region, given the bases and the troops that they have there on the border. And so there's a bit of this kind of division of labor at this point on security and the economy. But I think over time, as China would increase its economic investments, if indeed they do, and as long, I think if their main issue with Central Asia is that it's stable, and that their Islamist institutions, movements, people do not get into Xinjiang province, from Central Asia, and if that is relatively covered by the Russians and the states themselves, then I think they'll be willing to kind of accept that division of labor. That could change over time. Just on Iran, quickly, I think as I look at the Chinese, well, at least the Silk Road economic belt, I kind of think of it more in terms of kind of paving a giant superhighway from Western China to the greater Middle East, and for more straight direct access to particularly hydrocarbon resources in the greater Middle East. I think so. Iran is a much bigger prize. It's much more significant, I think, at least economically and energy-wise, obviously for China than Pakistan. I think the interest in Pakistan mainly has to do with the concerns about what might happen in Xinjiang. David, I'm not sorry that the six-party talks, the members of whom would be which?
Iran, China, Pakistan, India, Russia, and Afghanistan. But they've invited the Central Asians as well. And the question is, as it gets bigger, are there growing challenges to its actually moving forward?
I haven't looked at it closely, but I think it's just in general, Dave, I think that as the group becomes bigger, it becomes harder to manage. It's kind of looking at the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You brought in India, Pakistan, and Iran is in the offing. Is that going to make the organization make it easier for the organization to function, or actually more complicated because of the major political differences and different economic interests that those countries have? If I could just make one comment, should have been the concluding comment to my presentation. I think when I look at the Russian change of policy in Afghanistan, and I look at the change of policy toward Pakistan, there's one common denominator to those things, and they're coming. They are closer to the Chinese position in both ways. And if I look at, for example, the Russian position on North Korea over the past few years, it has also come closer to the Chinese position. And I think this does reflect a broader trend in Russian foreign policy. Since 2014 in particular, the Russians are more leveraged by the Chinese with the alienation of their relations with the West. And that is something for, I think, the Bush administration to consider as they look at these issues across a large, well, in different geographic areas. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just a couple of additional points. On the Central Asia piece, I do think one of the biggest strategic concerns that China had when it launched the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Silk Road Economic Belt in particular, was Russia's response. The fact that they were able to square that, even though there had been the acquiescence to the sort of enlarged Chinese economic role in Central Asia, I think the additional scale of the ambition in what was involved in the Silk Road Economic Belt, in the sense that it may have competed with the Eurasian Economic Union, the fact that they were able to square that politically, I think, was seen as one of the biggest sort of early political successes for the initiative. And of course, it coming about in an environment that was conditioned by Ukraine, conditioned by the changing parameters of the relationship between the two sides. There is this question as to whether the division of labor is something that over the long term China is entirely comfortable about. And it's already kind of striking seeing expanding military to military ties between the Chinese and the Central Asians, how much acquiescence, how far they had, for instance, run some of their new plans with the Tajiks through Russia. There are some question marks about that. Yeah. And I think the long-term expectation from some on the Chinese side is that they will have an expanded military role. And that's the point where you could, but we keep predicting points at which there'll be a collision and these things won't be squared, and et cetera, and at least for the last period of time, there's been seen to be enough reason for the two sides to figure these things out. But I think that's one point of contention. Just briefly, in addition on the Pakistan front, I mean, I think China has a long way to fall in public opinion terms. This is still it continues. I mean, approval ratings of China have continued to be at like 80%, 90% among the Pakistani public. It's always the outlier when you look around public opinion poll ratings of China around the world. So I do think there is a sort of residue of goodwill with the public as well as with Pakistani security and political elites. But it has been interesting seeing, I think they're going to be exposed by the nature of their involvement in a way that they were not before. I don't. I mean, although it's still limited, I think the fact that you are getting all of these critical articles about questions about the terms in which Chinese companies are getting, questions about long-term financial dependency questions, could Pakistan end up in the same situation as Sri Lanka, questions of course about nuclear power plants outside Karachi, questions about there's more of these things than I think were the case before, and it will be, I think it is one of the big interesting pieces. China has benefited from not being as involved in these things on such a day-to-day basis. It now looks a bit more like a sort of patron role in a more comprehensive way, and what that actually does to a relationship that's been extremely resilient but narrow, I think is going to be one of the big questions in the next stretch. Very briefly on the six-party talks. I mean, I think. I mean, on the Chinese side, there's been this constant tacking back and forth between kind of efficacy and geopolitical political sensitivities, and I think they convene various groupings that they think are efficacious, and they've convened groupings that have been about including countries that have then been sensitive about the fact that they're not incorporated into these things. I still question whether that falls into the category of an efficacious grouping. I mean, I think the QCG did have a really clear logic to it in terms of the roles of the countries involved and what they might have been expected to do, and the reasons that it failed were reasons that will not be addressed by having anyone else involved in the process. I mean, it doesn't directly answer your question, but I think during a period in which I think some degree of hope on China's part that they will actually be able to push this along really effectively has gone down. The rationale for them both doing a lot more bilaterally in Afghanistan, military aid, these kind of activities in Badakhshan and this sort of thing, and then kind of squaring some of the regional sensitivities around what they've been up to, which, you know, I think they were out on a limb a bit on some of this. I see some of it, from their side at least, being driven as much by that logic as, you know, actually getting an effective process together.
The problem with talking about talks in Afghanistan is that so long as the Taliban doesn't have any interest in sitting down at the table, and it really may be immaterial to talk about who else may be there. You know, and on Iran, I think it's worth pointing out that certainly there have been some media reports in Pakistan about Iran's potential interest in playing some sort of role in this trilateral relationship, whatever you want to call it. There's also been talk about Turkey possibly having some sort of role. But you look at Iran. Iran recently signed on to this new transport corridor project with India and Afghanistan involving the Charbahar port, which is small potatoes compared to CPEC, but still it shows the complexity of what's going on. I'd like to take one more very quick round of questions, and then we'll wrap out. What's that?
Charbahar is the benefit of being a real port.
Even better. So we're going to take there's a question down here. Oh, why don't you go ahead, sir?
Shahzad Habib, principal at INDUS. Just a quick question. Can Pakistan play a role for the U.S. as the U.S. takes a look at its China and Russia relationship? And if yes, you know, what would that mean from a U.S. foreign policy perspective?
Okay, hand the mic down here. Yes. You can have the final word.
Mohammed from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Andrew Kuchins, my question is to you. When talking about the Russia in Afghanistan, the six-party talks in Moscow, you said, I just want to make sure that I did not mishear that, that to a certain extent Russia is protecting the Afghan-Tajik border, and you also said that it's the case with Turkmenistan too?
I'm sorry?
That Russia is also playing some role in protecting Turkmen-Afghan border?
No, I'm mistaken about that. No, I take that back.
Okay, thank you.
So the question is?
Whether Russia is playing any role in protecting Turkmen-Afghanistan border.
Oh, okay.
Why don't you pose your question?
I have a question for Dr. Kuchins. Dr. Kuchins, you said Russia is not going to spend money. So if this trilateral coalition matures, what part do you see Russia is playing? Just economic, or only political, or a mixture of the two?
And the final question will be right over here. Right to your right, Kay. There you go.
Hi, Kay Johnson with Reuters. Kind of the elephant in the room that ties all this together is, of course, the Pakistan-U.S. Relationship. And it seems to me that Pakistan is, as you said, trying to be less dependent on the U.S. At what point, given how much we've seen from the U.S. about getting tough with Pakistan, threatening to walk away, at what point does Pakistan have more leverage on this? I mean, they already have so much. And what would that look like? When would we know that that happens?
Thanks. Maybe the three of you could offer 60-second or a bit more comment and final word on. You don't have to answer all the questions, but tough, huh? Well, let me ask you this. While they're thinking, is there one more final quick question to give them another 30 seconds?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I would turn to David Abramson right there in the audience on the question about the Russian role on the on the Turkmen-Afghan border. Turkmen have a very, very studious, independent, non-aligned status, but that there would not be ties between close ties between Russian and Turkmen intelligence and possibly special forces would be surprising to me, but I can't confirm that. On the Pakistan role in the U.S.-Russia relationship, I think to the extent that that there can be, a greater resolution in Afghanistan, which obviously the Pakistani role is essential, that would be, I think, a positive thing that Pakistan could do for the U.S.-Russia relationship and for the broader multilateral cooperation in Afghanistan. And on why the Russians aren't going to spend so much money or will not be willing to spend money, well, it kind of gets to, I think we're talking about, they're not so interested in the Central Asian states having connectivity to the south. They prefer to have the Central Asian states have more limited connectivity to the north through Russia. They've acquiesced essentially to the Chinese for, I think, reasons for economic and political reasons, to have them establish their connectivity to the east. And essentially, Turkmenistan has traded its basically its lack of independence in transit routes for its gas to the north to Russia for trade the gas going to China. And the Russians have been okay with that, but I wouldn't see them being particularly enthusiastic again about this connectivity to the south. It's a way for them to keep a hold on the Central Asian states.
Just from the China angle on the U.S.-Pakistan question, China really dislikes situations in which the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is in a bad way because it puts their own relationship with Pakistan under much closer and problematic scrutiny, and because it removes from Pakistan an essential source of military support and financial and economic support and diplomatic support. And so in a context in which China is stressing to Pakistan that it should sustain or upgrade its relationships with almost any other party when there's particularly when there's a risk that a problematic relationship will affect this really important investment. I mean, the thing about CPEC is it's not just about Pakistan, it's not just about the region. It has ended up being this symbolic showcase project for the entire Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping personally, it is this peculiar situation in which Pakistan has ended up, and I absolutely don't think this was the intention when they went into it, but this has ended up being a test case, and the political sensitivities around that mean that there is additional kind of interest, involvement, pressure that comes in from the top political levels on the Chinese side on this stuff. And I mean, we had in 2011 a situation in which the US-Pakistan relationship was really in a bad way, and China did play a role at that point in saying, no, we're not going to sign a new defense pact. We're not going to. You have to fix this. And I still think and again, this is pure. There are other dynamics in play here, but from China's perspective, I think they want to see at least a floor on where the U.S.-Pakistan relationship could get to. The only scenario in which that wouldn't be the case is if the U.S.-China relationship went into such a dire state that it was then a matter of indifference. Even then, I think they'd still see some utility in the US playing a particular role vis-a-vis Pakistan, because their equities in South Asia don't immediately change. But I think there is a sort of there's a looking at the moment for some of these lines to harden and kind of countervailing axes and things. And I think it's still in very much a strong interest on the part of at least some of the actors, and certainly on China's part, to ensure that that doesn't happen.
There was a question on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship and which side has more leverage. There's current talk of trying to assemble a toolkit of policy measures that can be used to create incentives and punitive measures for Pakistan to get it to change its behavior, let's say, vis-a-vis India and militant groups that are predominant or active in Afghanistan. I think when we look at U.S. efforts to put pressure, U.S.-led efforts to put pressure on other countries like Iran, there was at least a consensus at the P5 level at the UN Security Council. We were able to assemble a coalition. I think the fact that Pakistan has a strong ally in the form of China, has been able to develop this newfound relationship with Russia, and is even bolstering ties with Iran and Saudi Arabia in a very complicated period, and has also deepened its relationship with Turkey, suggests that I think we perhaps overestimate our ability to kind of influence this country, which is very capable of engaging in this rope-a-dope measures when its back is to the wall.
And just as a bookend to that, one can argue that Pakistan, by deepening its ties to Russia and China, even if we're not talking about a formal alliance, and by engaging more, trying to engage more with Turkey and Iran and other countries, it clearly is meant as a response to those in New Delhi that claim to be trying to launch some type of, I don't like using this term, a diplomatic isolation campaign. Clearly this is an effort, or can be seen as an effort, to push back against that. So on that note, we will have to wrap up. We will need to adjourn. If you could all join me in another round of applause for our speakers. Thank you. Thank you to the three of you, and also thank you to INDUS and to Athar and your colleagues. Many thanks for this coming to this interesting discussion. We're adjourned.
That's very good.